So you want to know more about Joseph Smith's first vision, largely seen as the founding moment of the Mormon tradition. My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American history, religious studies with an expertise in Mormon history. Every Friday on this YouTube channel, I do one of my So You Want to Know More About X topics, where I peel back the historiographical layers and give you some insights on what books and articles you should read on various topics so you can become an expert yourself. And I try to provide some of the most important details you can learn from this great work that brilliant scholars have been producing over the years. This week's video was prompted by a wonderful Radio West interview, a KUER NPR station out in Utah, that interviewed John Turner, who is the author of the brand new biography of Joseph Smith with the subtitle The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. I've done a previous video on this new biography and the broader corpus of Joseph's biographies in a previous Friday video, but one comment that John Turner made in that video prompted this discussion, which is he was asked by Doug Fabrizio, the legendary and wonderful host of Radio West, what do you make of the arguments that the different accounts of Joseph Smith's first vision reveal how the Mormon prophet was evolving in his understanding of the Godhead? And John Turner took a heavy sigh and said, actually, lots of scholars don't get hung up on those details. And I've seen a lot of people kind of react to that comment in different ways, because to Latter-day Saints and ex-Mormons, the details of the first vision matter. But to scholars, they approach that episode and the narratives of that episode quite differently. So in this video, I want to give an overview of the various scholarly approaches to Joseph Smith's first vision, what we can learn from them, and how we can see the diversity of approaches within the scholarly arena. I'm going to be highlighting a number of books, but importantly, a number of articles that you should be able to read for free so you too can become an expert on the topic. Let's dig in. It would be hard to overstate the significance of Joseph Smith's initial theophany, or an experience with the divine, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One of their lesson manuals, still used in Sunday school today, includes this quote from Gordon B. Hinckley, who presided over the LDS Church from 1995 to 2008, in which he says that the validity of the LDS tradition relies on the validity of that vision. It either happened or it didn't, and if it did, that gives all the importance and significance to the LDS Church claims that move beyond that, because it is a astounding point. It is a starting point. It is a foundational principle. The issue is, like many religious experiences, it's hard to prove it through documentary evidence. Now, there is some documentary evidence to how Joseph Smith narrated that first vision to others. The issue is there are some differences in those accounts that have often been the focus of debates between apologists on one hand, those who are defending the church, and critics on the other, trying to tear it down. At stake is there are a handful, about a half dozen, of first-hand accounts that come either from Joseph Smith or were recorded in his presence. The first reference to Joseph Smith's first vision, not the first account, but the first reference, has only really been identified recently as a reference to the first vision in a document titled The Articles and Covenants of the Church, which was written in late 1829, early 1830 in preparation for the church's organization. It was published in the Book of Commandments in 1833 as chapter 24, or would have been published if that book made it all the way to publication. And then it later appeared in Doctrine and Covenants. It is now known as Doctrine and Covenants 20 in the modern LDS tradition. In this account, which you can see here, it says that Joseph Smith received, or it was manifested to him that he had received a remission of his sins. That seems to be an indirect reference there to his earlier experience with being told that his sins were forgiven, which should give some hint into how Joseph Smith and the early Mormons viewed that story. It was a personal redemption story. It was a personal salvific encounter with God through which Joseph Smith's sins were forgiven, but it did not have as much significance to the broader church as a whole. That significance comes later. Other accounts include in 1832 when Joseph Smith narrates his first history. In fact, he takes the pen in his hand and recounts the first vision in his own handwriting. This is the most intimate of the Joseph Smith accounts of the first vision. The issue is it only mentions hearing from the Lord. It doesn't mention two personages. It also talks about a pillar of fire. And again, it emphasizes Joseph Smith being forgiven for his sins, not being told to start a church. You have an 1835 episode where Joseph Smith narrates it to someone else and makes it in his diary. And then in 1838, you get Joseph Smith overseeing the creation of a history of the church. And it's only in that point that the first vision is now framed as the founding of an entire religious denomination, not just a personal salvific narrative. It's that account, written in 1838 to 39, that ends up being canonized, that you can find in the LDS scripture in the Joseph Smith history. And then by Nauvoo, Joseph Smith is relating the first vision to various people, and it appears in a number of histories. But when you drill down on those different accounts of the first vision, you have critics on the one hand saying, well, there's an evolution in how many personages is Joseph Smith speaking to. At one account, he talks about various angels appearing. Another, he says it's just the Lord. Another, it's the two beings. And one, he's told that his sins are forgiven. And the other says that all the churches are wrong. Scholars, however, they approach this, and this is by and large, not unanimous, so a majority view this, and they mostly focus on the similarities, the commonalities, that Joseph Smith was told his sins were forgiven, that he was told to seek further light knowledge, and that he spoke with a divine being, either one or two. Scholars do a practice of what they call bracketing the truth claims, meaning we are approaching these religious claims of those in the past. We can't tear them down or build them up. Instead, we are bracketing the truthfulness of whether they happen or not, and instead explaining their cultural meaning and impact. What is clear, and this should not be a surprise given that I just overviewed how Joseph Smith and Saints saw it as primarily a personal story, not a church story, the first vision did not play a major role in the early church narratives, whether this be Oliver Cowdery's history written in 1834 or 35, Parley P. Pratt's Voice of Warning, the best-selling pamphlet introducing people to Mormonism in the 19th century, John Whitmer, who was the first church historian when he writes his history in the 1830s, or even when Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph Smith's mother, writes a family memoir. All of them focuses on the original moment being when Moroni appears to Joseph Smith, not his first vision. Now, that does not change until starting in Nauvoo, you get a number of histories that place the first vision at the start, Orson Pratt's history, Joseph Smith's history that starts during that time, as well as, of course, the number of newspaper interviews I mentioned before. But it's really not until the 20th century that the first vision takes on added importance. Kathleen Flake, in her wonderful book, The Politics of American Religious Identity, The Seeding of Reed Smoot, a Mormon Apostle, talks about how in the wake of giving up polygamy, Mormons were trying to find a new hinge point that holds their faith together because their core doctrine, plural marriage, was no longer there anymore. And so they turned to the first vision. And then one other book that I'm going to mention several times in this video is Stephen Harper's The First Vision, Memory and Mormon Origins, published just a few years ago by Oxford University Press, which has the broad sweeping history of not just the various accounts of the first vision, but how the first vision has been interpreted anew with each generation. So if there's one book that you come away from this video with on your reading assignment, I would recommend it being Steve Harper's The First Vision, Memory and Mormon Origins. All right, so let's get into some more historiographical overviews and summaries and engagements with this historical tale. And let's start with the visionary world. While the Latter-day Saint narrative since Joseph Smith to the present has largely been that Mormonism was created, that the gospel had to be restored because they were now living in an era where revelations had ceased, that God had gone silent. The truth was actually the opposite. Early America was known as a spiritual hothouse. That's a term thrown around by a number of scholars, in which people had the ability to found their own churches based on their own religious and visionary experiences. The classic book in this field is Nathan Hatch's The Democratization of American Christianity. Joseph Smith and the Mormons play a big role in this book that emphasize that those religions that flourish were those that had allowed the individual to get a sense of divine. And these experiences, like the first vision, were at the core of their message. More recently, I really enjoyed the book by Adam Jortner, Blood from the Sky, Miracles in Politics in the Early American Republic, which emphasized that all these new religious traditions were basing their claims on some theophonic religious experience where God spoke to them, and that disrupted the political environment of America. And of course, Joseph Smith and the Mormons fit into that story. But let's talk about an article that you can read for free online. I strongly recommend Richard Bushman's article, The Visionary World of Joseph Smith, published in BYU Studies a couple decades ago, which places Joseph Smith's sacred vision and his visionary accounts in the context of others who were also saying that they were hearing from God and being told what to do and whether their sins were forgiven. In other words, we need to understand the visionary climate in which the first vision was produced. But how do scholars approach the different accounts of the first vision? This is often the most common question I will get when discussing the first vision is, how do scholars make sense? Why did Joseph Smith wait so long to give an account? And why do they have differences in perspectives? Well, here are a few attempts of scholars to contextualize and explain those different accounts. First, I'll talk about D. Michael Quinn's article, Joseph Smith's Experience of a Methodist Camp Meeting in 1820, published as a dialogue paper a couple decades ago. This is classic Quinn in that it's over 100 pages long, 248 footnotes, and it tries to contextualize Joseph Smith's different accounts in the periods in which they were written. I've also already recommended earlier Stephen Harper's book, The First Vision, Memory and Mormon Origins. It has a chapter on each of these different accounts, and he uses not just historical context and sources, but psychological approaches of what does it mean to retain memory and then recite that memory in order to explain how it might appear differently in these different contexts to different audiences. Now, scholars outside the LDS faith, Steve Harper, writes from within the LDS tradition, but those scholars outside the LDS tradition take a very similar approach. I had mentioned before this idea of bracketing, of not trying to make a statement on the truth claims of these visionary episodes, but instead explaining what they mean. No scholar has been at the forefront of this more than the scholar Ann Taves, who taught at Claremont Graduate University for a few years, and then University of California, Santa Barbara, has written a number of really important books and articles to understand religious experiences and narratives, even if we don't believe they actually happen. Now, she actually had a dialogue with Stephen Harper, one of the experts on the first vision, that was published in the journal Mormon Studies Review. It's titled Joseph Smith's First Vision, New Methods for the Analysis of Experience-Related Events. You can find this free online, and they move from account to account, talking about what are we going to make of these accounts within the context of religious experiences and antebellum America. One final context that I want to emphasize when trying to understand why these first vision accounts might appear differently in different settings is the concept of narrative. Meaning when people write, they write in a way that tries to draw words and phrases and understandings from existed literatures. Scholars often refer to this as a communities of discourse approach. One article that I recommend that exemplifies how scholars have utilized this is Christopher Jones, who's now the editor of Journal Mormon History, who wrote the article, The Power and Form of Godliness, Methodist Conversion Narratives and Joseph Smith's First Vision. And Jones takes Joseph Smith's first vision accounts and compares them to other narratives that were written by American Methodists at the same time. Remember, Methodism was the faith that Joseph Smith was most likely to join before he formed his own religion. So it makes sense that he was trying to craft his narrative to match those among the Methodists. But how did the understanding and significance of the first vision evolve in the LDS Church in the ensuing 2 centuries? This has been the topic of a number of great scholarship. I've already mentioned Harper's The First Vision book, so I'll give one final reference here, where it talks about every generation approaching the first vision in different ways. And I will say that he has nuanced the traditional ways of framing of understanding, because typically scholars have said that the first vision was mostly unknown and ignored in the first couple decades. Harper actually found a number of instances in which the first vision was spoken, was referenced in the 1830s even. And so he's nuancing, though not completely overturning, those traditional narratives. But one other article that talks about the evolution of the first vision in LDS thought is James Allen in his article, Emergence of a Fundamental, the Expanding Role of Joseph Smith's First Vision in Mormon Religious Thought. This is a brilliant and comprehensive overview that you can read free online that shows that Latter-day Saints have tried to grapple with not just the first vision as an idea, but the competing texts at stake. One of my favorite anecdotes that you can find from these different scholarship, including in Steve Harper's book, is Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the LDS church historian from about 1920 to about 1970 when he became the church president. He was the grandson of Hiram Smith, so he had stake in the claim. He apparently felt so uncomfortable with the 1832 account of Joseph Smith's first vision, because it differed from the canonical account written a few years later, that he had it physically removed from the historical letter book in which it was found. And you can find lots of other fascinating nuggets in these works that I'm referencing. Now, I want to close this discussion with an anecdote to kind of emphasize how people from different backgrounds might approach the first vision differently, and how it might not always fall along the lines you might expect. In 2009, when I was fresh out of undergraduate school, I was very privileged to take part in a summer institute that was run by Terrell Givens and Matt Groh, two excellent scholars in Mormon history. And one of our guest speakers at our daily workshop was Richard Bushman, the phenomenal historian and biographer of Joseph Smith. And as part of the workshop that day, he brought out printouts from different books on Mormon history that narrated the first vision, 1 or 2 page narrations of the first vision. He made copies of those pages, and he made sure to hide the identifying marks, so we did not know what book it was coming from and therefore what author wrote them. And after we read those accounts, we were supposed to guess, was this account written by a believing Latter-day Saint historian, a critical Mormon historian, or a non-Mormon scholar? We thought this would be easy. It wasn't. We couldn't get any of them right. The narratives that appeared most generous and just took the first vision at face value were those written by non-Mormon scholars. Those that tried their best to appear neutral were typically written by the critics. And those that tried to dissect it and focus on the differences were often written by believing Latter-day Saints. And that's just a reminder that the stakes can sometimes play out differently in these different settings. I hope this video was useful. I hope you are coming away with a list of books and articles to read so that you too can contribute to the vibrant discourse on the first vision. And I hope you are catching a glimpse on how the scholarly industry of dissecting religious ideas, practices, and events and truth claims can differ from those for whom this is a really important facet of their individual faith or deconversion narrative. If you found this video useful, please make sure to like it and share it with others, and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. History has never been more relevant than it is today, and so I'm glad to have these conversations with you.